Ready? Activate.
Go.
And this yours. This yours right here.
Oh, that's mine?
Yeah. We all got the same book, but I like the spots that I underlined.
Yeah, all right. You got that one.
All right. Perfect.
Yeah.
So, we just kind of went over who we were and such. Everyone know me,
All right.
and everyone probably know Al as well from comments at the public meetings and stuff. I'm guessing.
Those people wouldn't know me.
For sure.
The other ones in the area that might know me is I'm the guy with the Jesus sign on at the end of my driveway and the end of Michelin and Staple.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, Brad, if you just want to, I mean, you said a bunch of stuff. You obviously have a lot of experience, and but how would you introduce yourself in a short way?
Well, I was a history teacher for 25 years, and then I retired. And I was on a popular TV show on the History Channel called The Curse of Civil War Gold. I live in Ravenna, in Muskegon County, out in the country. And I enjoy studying history, discussing all kinds of different topics, and happy to be invited by you guys.
Perfect.
We're glad you're here.
Yeah, for sure.
And
I don't know much about these topics, but I'm here to learn.
So, I haven't come in with a specific agenda. I think we'll probably go through a wide political range and probably a wide religious range, and then try to focus that on some of the stuff that Dalton specifically do in the food sovereignty we were discussing earlier and stuff like that. But it sounds like you have four topics specifically that you wanted to go over. Were you mentioning that? You had 4 topics?
you did actually, and you submitted them to us.
Okay.
You know, ARPA,
Yeah.
the sovereignty
Yeah.
issue. Let's see. It was Magdeburg.
Confession, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and there was one other
I got
that
it.
you had listed. Yeah, pull it up.
Okay.
So, I don't know, what would you like to start with?
I was gonna ask the same thing.
Okay.
So I think probably our most obvious disagreement, because I think we agree on probably a lot of our ends, a decent number of the means on a variety of topics, but with a wide amount of disagreement as well. But the most obvious is probably ARPA. So if we want, I'm disagreeing.
Yes.
So if we want to tackle that one first, I think it's reasonable. I don't think we'll come to an agreement on it, but I think we'll come to a clear disagreement on it.
So the 4 topics were decentralization, Magdeburg, ARPA, and sovereignty.
Perfect. Yeah, that sounds good. I wrote that.
Well, that's
Yes, you
Oh, man,
did.
those are good suggestions.
That's what you had sent along to me. Anyways,
Perfect. Yeah,
Well,
I have no problem
so
ranging.
what is ARPA?
Ranging all over the place. So ARPA is funding, right? This came through under Biden. It's one of the general society bailout projects that the United States is doing now. When we went with the idea that everything's too big to fail, and we started bailing stuff out, like the corporate socialism, there's an expansion to it to a more direct type of communist direct funding thing. And so in Trump's term, he came out with CARES, which is about $2 trillion. And that's where people were getting checks for $600 and stuff like that, all of that.
what's the acronym stand for? CARES?
CARES, I'm not sure, you know?
I don't. It has revenues in the R, but same with ARPA. What's the acronym for ARPA?
I can't remember offhand. We can probably Google it.
We need to do that because it's relevant.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so there was $2 trillion right at the end there for CARES, which was this type of COVID relief. And that had these restrictions on it for you to do.
Yeah, the
masks.
C was the COVID,
Right.
the R is relief.
The
Yeah.
CARES Act is the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Securities Act.
There.
Yeah.
So that.
And then that one had various restrictions on it, with like gloves and masks, and medical stuff in general. The township also received some of that. Money was just going everywhere. Right?
Yeah.
The township received some of it, and when I came in, still had some. We sent some of that money back because how much hand sanitizer are we going to buy? You know, it gets a little ridiculous.
Good
So-
question to ask.
Yeah. So some of that money went back. And then Biden did almost the exact same thing. When he got in, it was $2 trillion, almost the same amount of money, but it was for infrastructure because the government had shut the economy down for a couple of years. And so, but it was supposed to be like an infrastructure relief bill. And in the infrastructure relief bill, because it was passed at the federal level for political reasons, you couldn't even do roads with it, which is kind of a joke, right? Infrastructure without roads. And you could basically do broadband expansion, water service expansion, sewer expansion, or bonus to employees. And so none of those made sense for Dalton except for broadband expansion. So I pushed on that one pretty hard. Failed, looked into 15 different companies, and didn't get anything to move on it. And then they were still making up the rules, as the feds do. And eventually they came up with 400 pages of rules. Force someone under a $10 million budget, which Dalton is, you can spend it on government services. They just, instead of being restricted to only those things, essentially a whitelist, it was a blacklist. So it's
I thought the stipulation was any expenditure that you received from ARPA under $10 million, there was pretty much no accountability.
Well, there are very few restrictions, not accountability. We have to report.
But I thought that level of spending was established because I remember
10 million.
I remember when Muskegon went ahead and they started doing a housing project and people were concerned about, you're using ARPA funds to do a housing project?
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a big question there. And then they had responded, well, anything under $10 million, we're good to go.
If you're getting under $10 billion, then it's way opened up. So you can do government services. There's restrictions on what you can't do. Because one of the things I want to do is pay down the sewer debt. That's why I talked about it. And they, right from the beginning, they said you can't pay any debt. We want you to acquire more debt, if anything, right? And then even with their adjustments, even after 400 pages of rules, you still can't pay any debt.
That's the same common sense as spending a bunch of money to combat inflation.
Yes.
The inflation. Going to solve inflation by throwing $1 trillion.
It's
in.
like shooting yourself in the foot by shooting yourself in the foot again.
Yeah.
Shooting the other foot.
Yeah, exactly. Makes no
Pretty
sense. But it does, it sells to a lot of people.
Well, the people love money, right?
They do. Yeah.
And most people will do most anything for money.
Yeah. Well, and they don't see the cause and effect or the secondary cause.
Very low information voters, though.
Right.
Yeah. All right. So then I'll give you my view
Yes.
on the ARPA spending. And I did write something down here just a little bit because you need to know, I wanted to be clear about why I think what I think and what I believe what I believe.
Yeah.
So when COVID hit, everybody was concerned. We'd have to say, other than those maybe that were on the other side of the situation, depending on what that was, they may not have been afraid, but they were sure putting fear into society. So, I waited a couple of weeks and there was a lot of pressure. There's a lot of social pressure to come on, are you serious? What? You don't believe this is happening or what? I was the guy that was going, well, I'm waiting to see if this is legitimate. What's the evidence here?
Right.
And we were being inundated through the programming device of television telling us what to believe and when to believe and why to believe. And so we started as independent researchers, we started checking out our own independent resources on the internet, online. And there was a lot of good ones and there's a lot of terrible ones, but you have to filter through it. So anyways, I very early on started seeing things that didn't add up. For instance, they put out a video on Italy of a critical care area that, it was inundated with all these people coming in, had the COVID.
Yeah.
All right. Well, within 2 weeks, all of a sudden it was already here in the States, and they put out the same exact video that they did in Italy.
You called it New York?
And called it New York.
Yeah, I remember that one.
And then they had refrigerator trucks down there, ready for a temporary morgue because so many people were dying. Well, I'll tell you what, there was guys that were riding their bikes and everything else down there with video. Everybody's got a video camera now with a phone.
Right.
And they were videoing what was going on down there. And they're saying, this is nothing like what they're telling you folks.
Mm-hmm.
So the suspicions began to grow and mount inside of my own thinking process, right? And I'm a man of God too. I'm a Christian, so I got the Holy Spirit in me. I believe that's directed me into all truth. All right, not that I can't make a mistake in judgment. But if I listen to the Spirit of God, He's going to lead me into all truth, and that's His promise. So, anyways, so of course the Spanish flu came up as part of their injection of evidence as to why virus or vaccinations are critical. Right? We saw what happened in the past, so now we have to do this. So, anyways, Spanish flu. More people died of the Spanish flu than bullets during the First World War. 16 million World War I, 50 million Spanish flu between 1918 and 1920. It didn't start in Spain, and it wasn't a flu. It started in the US. It was bacteria that caused severe and in most cases lethal pneumonia. It was the killer in 92% plus of autopsies reviewed. All right. First cases, bacterial pneumonia in 1918 traced back to a military base, Fort Riley, Kansas. First half of 1918, experimental meningitis vaccine cultured in horses by the Rockefeller Institute was injected into soldiers at Fort Riley. Millions of soldiers were vaccinated. 2 million went overseas. They fought under unsanitary conditions, so the bacteria spread like wildfire. Bacteria, not virus. It was a bacterial infection. All right. The story our government then told was they brought home all kinds of diseases. So the general public was vaccinated as well. All over Europe, people were vaccinated as well. Only the vaccinated died in general. All right. Who was in charge of the mass vaccination program? The Rockefeller Institute. Who is the main scientist in charge? Dr. Frederick Gates. That's Bill Gates' dad. All right. A eugenicist. A man who wanted to depopulate. He had a specific agenda. All right. Those who survived, they called cloud adults, spread the bacteria to others, even the unvaccinated. Now, today we would call that shedding. Now, that's bacteria. That's not breathing out into the air, and all of a sudden you breathe it in, and then you got it.
Right.
That's what they tell us a virus will do. Though there's never been a virus that was purely isolated. Not one. And the challenge is out there to the medical association to give us the proof, and they can't. All right? So there's another problem. So now we go to spread of Spanish flu is never experimentally confirmed. Perhaps if we have learned anything, it is that we are not quite sure what we know about the disease. Young adults were the most vulnerable group to the 1918-1919 Spanish flu, the history's deadliest pandemic that claimed about 50 million lives. Epidemiological, say that for me,
Epidemiological.
Epidemiological, yeah, right. Observations suggest that the Spanish flu influenza virus spread by human contact, by human experiments, seem to suggest otherwise. Puzzling Human Studies, the landmark study of Milton J. Rosenau, MD, Experiments to Determine Mode of Spread of Influenza, was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1919. They isolated microbial mixtures from the throat and noses of carefully selected influenza cases from an outbreak location. The researchers then administered these to 10 young U.S. Navy volunteers without prior exposure to influenza. None fell sick. They drew blood from influenza patients and transferred it to the Navy volunteers. None fell sick. They collected influenza patients' mucous membranes with swabs and filtered them to exclude larger microbes like bacteria. They then injected the filtrate into the Navy volunteers. Guess what? None fell sick. All right, and they brought the Navy volunteers to meet influenza patients. They shook hands and conversed. The patients also exhaled as hard as possible onto the volunteer's face for 5 times. Then the patients coughed directly onto the volunteers. None fell sick. So
Yeah, but you're just talking about corruption in the medical industry, right?
I'm talking about the fact that, first of all, viruses are not real. All right? There's medical proof that tells us that they're not. What a virus is, if you further study it, it's your own body releasing solvents, maybe once or twice a year. And what that's all about is to generate your immune system to respond and pretty much flush your system out of crap that's accumulated over the past year. That's God's perfect immunal design. All right. So what they want to put a label of a virus on had an ill intent by a hugely funded, one specific individual, Rockefeller, to create a whole industry of money gathering technology that would make him one of the wealthiest men in the world. So this whole idea of viral infections, which was what they used to base COVID on, was a lie. All right. From my point of view, in my study and my research.
Sure.
So if you're basing that on a lie, well, what's your true intent? Well, I was given a 205-page dossier on Anthony Fauci, and I delivered it to the prosecutor here in Muskegon County.
Mm-hmm.
And that was proof positive that Anthony Fauci and Mr. Dosich from North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Fauci was funding it. Dosich was doing the research, and they were creating a weapon. A microbiotic weapon down there, And so,
I mean, a bunch of this stuff has been published. In Nature magazine in 2015, they published an article that the Wuhan lab was working with U.S. universities to develop gain of function research to take coronavirus from bats in Wuhan and make it infect.
Well, that's what they told you. They took coronavirus from bats.
Successful.
Now that's kind of ridiculous, actually.
But
because there's no solid proof of that. And first of all, going back to what I just said, no virus exists, and they have no proof. They have no proof of it.
Have you ever looked at the Flexner report from 1910?
I don't know that I have.
It's an amazing example of corruption in the medical field. Now, if I get shot or stabbed, take me to the hospital for sure.
Yeah.
But otherwise,
or break a leg.
Yeah. But otherwise, I don't go to doctors. Right. So, and I understand that's connected to CARES and ARPA and stuff like that.
Directly connected.
It is. But so your point is that we shouldn't accept the ARPA funds.
Absolutely not, because they were given, from my point of view, they were given as financial payouts and payoffs, almost as though a bonus plan to people that went along to get along and complied and didn't do their own due diligence. They didn't do their own research. And, even in a governmental body like this, you're there to help protect the interests of the people, right? And you guys, even more so than even us, probably, maybe not, but I would say you're more responsible because you have governing authority over us. So you guys should have been beating that bush, investigating on your own to determine whether or not this stuff was legitimate. And I think many people just, the majority would say, and the news says, and nobody that I've run into that was in a governmental office yet has explained to me how they were doing their own research and found out contrary. And then the money came along. And once the money comes along, it changes the whole scope of things.
Well, it's obviously a political move.
Now you can justify your actions by saying, well, we'll do better good for the community by spending this money on the community and we'll all benefit. Well, and remember what I told you from the stand over here, that if you use unlawful money, it's misuse of money.
It's lawful.
Well, it's not.
It is lawful. The legislator passed it.
Well, that might be legal.
Correct.
But is that lawful?
Well, moral could be separated, or ethical could be separated from legal, but it is legal.
Well, now we're getting into another realm.
Correct.
We're getting into legal versus lawful. So what is lawful?
How do you define it? Religious.
Right up here. We've all been created by God.
Mhm.
So he's at the top of the governmental system. Word of God says all of government is on the shoulders of Jesus Christ. Now, Jesus Christ, we know, are believers, is God. All right? So then he created us in his image, people. And he said, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom. Okay, we're free to do things in this life. You know, we're free to direct our own path. We're free to marry who we want. We're free to live where we want. Should be. But even that is changing. So under the republic system that was established at the founding of this country, they set up grand juries at the federal level, at least, and at the state level. Then juries, okay? The people, trial by the people.
Mhm.
If you have one dissenting view on a jury, the case gets thrown out, all right? And a prime example of that is in Montana for 4 years, they had people that understood this, okay? And they understood that underneath the people, we stand on the Constitution.
Mhm.
The Constitution is not over us. The Constitution is under us. We wrote the Constitution. We designed it. We proclaimed it. And the Constitution was to watch over this group here. The executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. The local government entities and state government entities. So that if they stepped outside of this, we had recourse. We could go to a grand jury or we could go to a jury and we could bring a complaint against these guys.
Mhm.
And once we got there, we'd have a final say. But it's all been flipped on its head now. You know, people are at the bottom. A lot of people in this country think that the Supreme Court is at the top,
Yes.
you know, right?
Well, they said they were in the late 1800s.
Yeah, the
Margaret
rules that they
Madison.
were.
And Margaret was Madison, they decided to let everyone know that they were.
There we go. There we go.
Well, so there's a bunch. So you went over a bunch, right?
Yeah.
So is the medical industry corrupt? Yes. Can it be fixed? Probably not. There's an inherent conflict of interest in that field, just like with lawyers, right?
Yeah.
So the best situation business-wise for a lawyer is someone with legal trouble. The best situation medically for the industry is for someone with medical trouble,
Illness, yeah.
right? And so there's an inherent conflict of interest that there's not an obvious way to take that out. So you get all that, the Flexner report from
That's-
1910s.
That's a general explanation though. For instance, when I was a kid, we had a doctor who seemed really cared about us,
Correct.
you know.
Well, you need good people.
Yeah.
You can't fix a bunch of bad people with good policy. Like it doesn't work. Right?
And he wasn't just out there to administer drugs for the most part, from what I could tell. Maybe later on.
So there's all of that. But when you get into like the ARPA fund, so it's legal, right? And passed by the legislature and all this stuff. Obviously, a political move by the feds to say, hey, we're giving you money. We are your saviors. A lot of people look to the government to be the savior, which is completely wrong.
They
right?
do.
Very high level of dependence.
They do.
And then it was used, I think it's more useful not as a distraction, right? So our board is a good example, right? If you take a group of dogs and you throw a piece of meat in the middle, you can do whatever you want. The dogs are not going to pay attention to you.
Right.
So it's kind of ends up being this distraction.
Yeah.
And then it's just clunky. And overall, it's a bad system. The whole bailout system, the grant-based system, what it does is it means that if you're very intelligent, what you want to not be good at is necessarily just straight business of catering to the market like it should to improve people's lives. Now you need to be good at playing the political game because that's where the money is. Right? And so there's a bunch of corruptions in that system. But morally, and I try to look at things through a moral lens, right? You have acquired moral obligations, and you're right. If you become a local elected official or elected official at whatever level, you have a higher level, I think, of moral responsibility. The tendency is for those people to probably be less moral, right? It's probably the tendency, but you should have a higher level of moral obligation. But so I don't have just a moral obligation to myself and my family and my friends group. I have a moral obligation to all of the citizens, even the people that didn't vote for me, inside of the township. A higher level of moral obligation than I have to someone outside of the township.
Love your neighbor as yourself.
You're saying there might be a reason why Washington DC Congress will not pass a law banning insider trading for themselves.
Right.
There might be a.
Well, and that's why I think a big part of why people loved Trump, right? Because Trump in the debates, he was like, the system is rigged, and everyone's like, yes, that is true. And then Clinton and Obama were on the other side, right? And they're like, then what needs to happen? They're trying to backpedal a lot of it in some way. And Trump's like, change the laws so that they work, because they're like, you don't pay any taxes. And he's like, yeah, because that's the way the laws are set up. So that's what I'll do. That's what I mean by it's rigged. And then he said, but you won't change the laws because you and all your friends use the same rigged system. And everyone's like, yeah, that's true. That makes sense.
I didn't finish that thought when I was up at the board. In Montana for 4 years, they had people on the grand jury that knew that the tax system is voluntary.
Okay.
And every tax issue that came before them by like the state attorney general or federal attorney general that they brought before them, they threw them out the door. They said, bye. Taxation is voluntary. So for 4 years, no one was charged with tax evasion in the state of Montana.
I bet those people are not on that jury anymore.
Well, and then that's the other thing. You know how many people are on the grand jury of the state of Michigan right now? What? And you know who it is? It's a judge out of the area of Detroit. It's Wyoming or someplace down there. There's one judge that sits as the grand jury in the state of Michigan. How does that happen?
Oh, right. But you're talking about levels of authority. I don't have the authority to change that. It doesn't, right? I mean, maybe if I was the governor, but I'm a township supervisor. And so you're in an actual situation, right? The situation is that we have in this specific context. So I can either take or reject the ARPA funds, right? And so, which I think the way this whole system is set up is messed up. It's bad, right? And I mean, Andrew Mellon wrote a great book in the 1920s called Taxation, and basically people are willing to pay taxes up to a certain level. Once you get above that, they consider it unreasonable. Poor people really don't have an option. Wealthy people do.
That happened with King George. His taxation level was at 10%.
Right, it was very small. Yeah.
And so they revolted and created a revolution at 10% taxation, and now we're over 50%.
Correct. And we've been way higher.
And we feel handcuffed and unable to do anything or unwilling to do anything.
Correct. Yeah, that's the general sentiment. It'll keep getting worse. I don't see how it would get better. But
Well, maybe there's forms of revolt that we need to consider and undertake.
yeah, but you're hitting an immense amount of things, right? So it's each one of these things is like a few hours of conversation, right? So it's on the ARPA thing, right?
Throw a whole bunch of things out there.
Just like scatter, like here's
Like a shotgun
bang of
blast.
stuff.
You're trying to answer one at a time. There's 2 more adds to it.
Well, so
All right.
like the ARPA funds, right? So if you consider it from a moral obligation standpoint, so participating in the system, you're looking at the eventual downfall of the country, right?
Right.
Now, the United States is becoming weaker economically. You see this in late stage empires. They start using a lot of mercenaries. We used a ton of mercenaries in the Middle East and stuff. We're showing a lot of signs of late stage empire, right?
Right.
And so that's not good. The nice thing for the United States situation overall is the rest of the world is weakening itself as well. So it's like we're all running a backwards race. Maybe Turkey and India are on the rise, right?
And
But
there's still free moral agents active in this system.
But I would say 100%, everyone is a free agent.
Well, they are, but do they know and do they know how?
Almost no one knows. And you probably have 2% of people that actually have strong, like moral intuition, conscience, right? That was,
Direction and
yeah. And so it's probably about 2% because you had the.
what do you think? What do you think about it?
Yeah.
Recently, the 29-year-old CEO of the Bitcoin and the super fund that he and his
Oh, that was stealing all the money?
yeah, and I forget, he's got an acronym. I forget, it's 3 letters.
You got the curly hair? No,
Yeah,
no.
with the big hair, 29 years old.
I knew you were talking about.
The company just collapsed last week.
FTX?
Yes, FTX.
Well, that was the outfit involved in Ukraine laundering money. Anyways,
Yeah. So when his business model went under, it was because he kept borrowing and borrowing and borrowing against different values. And of course, his mother was a liberal Stanford professor who gave $140 million to the Democrats, and he gave over $40 million to the Democrats. So that's kind of the ballpark where he was playing. And you don't see his home being raided like certain other former presidents. So
Trump.
I find that to be interesting, but also several financial analysts have come out and said the way that his business was structured is the same way that our country and Europe's countries and all the major economic players in this world are structured.
Yes.
And it's all a house of cards.
It's a house of cards.
And then you want to go back to, what Al mentioned in his lengthy description of the Spanish flu was a guy with the last name of Gates, and then a guy with the last name of Rockefeller.
Yeah, right.
And these are people that are very powerful in global organizations.
Right.
And so it strikes me as interesting that potentially people involved in global organizations that have meetings behind secrecy and closed doors would stand to benefit as events hurt actual countries and those individual governmental organizations that would stand alone and be patriotic and be, there's a word for it, I'm just escaping at the moment, but when you have a country that stands on its own, like the Trump, the MAGA, that kind of thing, they're trying to make that look bad. What would happen if all those countries collapsed at the same time? Who would step in the gap and run the world? I think that, when you potentially want to make order out of chaos, then
Now you're going somewhere.
I think that your motives and your actions should be carefully scrutinized.
Yeah, but it won't. You'll just fall into a bunch of wars.
Unless one organization is powerful enough to unite the entire world, get rid of borders. When Al was talking earlier, I thought, my goodness, he's talking about Rockefeller, Gates, and eugenics, and it reminded me of the Georgia Guidestones. And there are people out there who actually have been caught on camera behind closed doors saying that the world population needs to be 500 million people.
Yeah.
So we're sitting here in a township hall, and I think the average person is going, wow, this is overwhelming. And the forces and the powers that be on a global scale are insane. And
Always are, always have been, always will be.
yes, that's correct. But right now it seems to be more impending, more.
We're in a changing spot in history. We're in a super interesting spot in history.
We are.
A cool spot to live through.
Yes.
Because there's a lot that's going to change probably in the next few decades. And so
A few years, I would imagine.
it could be short. It's hard to call the time frame. Otherwise, so many kings wouldn't have lost their heads over history.
Well, and prophets as well were stoned for being false.
But let me ask you this. If we lose our freedoms, for
Obviously,
example,
that's a process that we are going through.
we absolutely. So 1.3 billion people in China have lost their freedoms already.
Never had.
Never had them, but anyway,
Yeah.
that'll be the equivalent to us losing them. They have to carry this around.
Yep.
Cash is not a thing. So I had a guy come do some concrete in my house. He said, "Boy, if they ever go to cash, it's going to kill all those contractors." Well, why? Because they can suddenly freeze your money, freeze your ability to buy and sell. And where in history is that described as being an important event when one government can freeze your ability to buy and sell.
Well, it's the finalization of a totalitarian system,
That's right.
right? So Hannah Arendt, probably the greatest political philosopher of the 1900s, she did a bunch of interesting work, but she considered totalitarianism to be a new political structure. First one in thousands of years, because the Greeks had all the different types of political structures.
They did.
But in the early 1900s, you get the rise of the fascists, the Nazis, the Soviets, the communists. And all of those where they're controlling specifically what you do at home in this minute way was this new thing. And you were hitting that because you're hitting new levels of population, new levels of technology is huge, and new levels of human density. And that really, it started there in the early 1900s. It was rough, World War I, World War II. But really, I think a century later, it's coming to fruition where you got the social credit score in China and stuff like this, and they can say what you can and can't watch on TV, what you can and cannot buy at the store, what you can and cannot do all of the time.
On social media. They might even block you on social media if you say something that's not popular or woke. Oh, wait a minute. So anyway, I'll say one more thing. I'll say one more thing before I sit back and listen, because I learned so much more by listening than I do talking. George Orwell said the last lie that the people need to accept before they control every aspect of your life is for you not to believe what you're watching in real person in real time.
Mm-hmm.
And so as you watch the events in the last 3 years,
Like the Emperor's Clothes.
like the Emperor's Clothes.
Yeah.
So I would challenge people who are thinking, are you being asked to accept as truth what you know to be a lie because you're seeing it right in front of you? And I think if he's saying that's the last step before we hit totalitarianism, that's a scary place to be in.
Yeah, for sure. The United States has a strong history of freedom growing off of the British history of freedom. And I think it's very good. You've heard me talk about going back to the Charter of Liberties at 1100 being a turning point.
Magna Carta.
In 1215. Yep. And so that's very, very important. And so we're resistant to that, right? When Russia turned and China turned communist and totalitarian, they were already poor. And then they went from being poor to being starving. The United States is unique because we're rich. And so we're going from rich to being poor, right? That would be.
And I'll mention Ukraine. Ukraine is a dictatorship as well. There's no freedom of press in Ukraine.
Right.
There's no freedom of speech in Ukraine.
Right.
The political opponent was locked up.
Yeah.
And this guy was installed.
Yeah, that's right.
I've had students in all those countries, right? And I've not had a student in a country that wasn't trying to get out of the country.
And I'd say even Russia and China and so forth, those countries were not autonomous. I mean, there was still behind the scenes a faction that was directing the course of history.
So it always says, but there's not one faction, there's a bunch of factions. You're a faction.
Well,
We're a faction.
but they were a ruling class faction.
Correct.
And
when you
when they bought the United States, there were 5 families that bought the United States, right? You had the Warburgs, you had the Rockefellers, you had the what was it?
Where's your research that says the United States was purchased?
Go ahead, you guys talk.
because they control a lot, right?
I'll bring it up.
Are you saying that there was a contract where
That we went bankrupt, and during Abraham Lincoln, the end of the Civil War, all right, bankruptcy evidently was declared. Is that true or not?
I find this fascinating because Abraham Lincoln said he was more afraid of the bankers behind him than he was of the Confederates in front of him.
Right.
So
Right.
I'm curious to hear all this.
Well, I've got to dig out the actual resource, so I can accurately share it with you. But in essence, that's when we were incorporated. When the United States for America became the United States, all capital letters, became a corporate entity. All right. And at that time as well is when they brought in their admiralty law, or the law of the sea. And that's why the court system that we currently have is being operated as admiralty law. They don't make that common knowledge, But all the terminology that's associated with that, the revenue system, is all admiralty law. All right. It's no longer civil law. It's no longer the law of the land that we originally had. So through the assemblies, they're really good at helping people understand this whole process and how it happened and when it happened and so forth. So now what we're dealing with is what they call a fictional government. It's a all right, you know what I'm talking about.
I know some of what you're talking about, but the issue is all you're saying is that the real government is not the government that's in power.
Not legitimate.
The only way to resolve that is war. You're just saying we should have a war.
I'm saying we have to try everything that we can as a people to reestablish lawful.
I'm saying it's as
Yeah,
realistic
yeah.
as Taiwan taking China.
And you may be right.
And they probably have the same claim.
And you may be right. But for instance, here's one step that I'm personally going to be taking. Okay. Yeah, I went to the prosecutor's office and I gave them this document, Mr. Anthony Fauci. And the proof was in the pudding. I mean, it was laid out perfectly legal according to the way you'd have to present it to a court. And they just decided to just shove it aside and do nothing about it, right?
Yeah.
Well, if I'm truly second on the list, all right, what's my alternative? Now, the group that sent me, Constitutional Law Group, they said we have a recourse. If they do not cooperate, if they do not, all we're asking them to do is send it along to a grand jury.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
And then in Michigan, you said that's only one judge.
But that will also have to implement that process of calling a 23-person grand jury. All right? You have to push on these things and push on them. If you know what is right to do, you have to keep doing what you know is right to do. And so my next, I FOIA'd. They said our recourse is to FOIA their bond information and put a complaint against their bond, right? And like if they get like 7 complaints against their bond, they can actually be removed from office. We could have removed Mr. Hilson or Mr. Michael Poulin as sheriff. We could have removed him because both of them chose to do nothing.
Theoretically. These are very difficult things to actually do.
Well, but in there, it talks about your position as a lesser magistrate
Correct.
in the system. And if you understand that, and you're a moral agent, there may come a time where you have to defy the commands that are coming down from above you. All right. You're not a soldier in the army.
Right.
You're a free moral agent. You're in that place as an appointment from God to hold back evil. Now, if that's who you are, you may not be that person. But I would be that person, a lesser magistrate in that place. And so if somebody had come to me with that information, I would have said, absolutely, there's cause here. There's just cause here. I see it. The evidence is clear. Call the grand jury. Let the people decide if there's a legitimacy.
Right, but you have to actually be in that place. Right? So I've been living for the last few years
Yep.
exactly like I would live in the Soviet Union. Right? And I've had students that grew up in the Soviet Union. I've talked to them, and they were talking about, should we move out? Should we escape Russia? It's going in a bad direction again. Right? You could really tell when they kicked out the Jehovah's and took all their property in 2017. Jehovah's are kind of a canary in the coal mine, right? Because they're not generally supported by the other Christians because they're not Trinitarian, they're subordinationists.
Like a Jehovah's Witness or?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And then they're actual pacifists. Like they actually won't fight back. It's very rare. The Quakers are kind of pacifists.
Kind of like Amish.
You know, the Amish, I would say the Amish are a little different. The Amish are Anabaptists. The Amish have had their own fights. The Quakers are probably closest to pacifists, but Nathaniel Greene was a general in the Revolutionary War. He was a general.
In regards to their activism against war and so forth and participation.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, there's Quakers. Well, like you were talking about with not paying taxes, there are Quakers that pay a peace tax. So they calculate the amount of money that the United States spends on military expenditures, which they disagree with. They subtract that percentage from their taxes, they pay those, and then they go to prison. Right? And so, which I respect a lot, but and I'm not a pacifist, but nevertheless, the Jehovah's hold that line pretty strongly, and so they won't fight back. They'll fight back in the courts and stuff. They took their case to the Supreme Court in Russia. I think everyone knew they were going to lose. And the way it came out in 2017 was that if you're still here in the morning, all of you are going to prison if you're Jehovah inside this country.
Oh, wow.
And so they had to hop on a plane that night and get out of that country, and they had all their property taken throughout the entire country of Russia, right?
Understandable.
Well, and so that is,
But at least they pushed the issue right to the
they did.
ultimate decision.
So they work very good as canaries in a coal mine to say, hey, some bad stuff is coming, right? And so it was pretty obvious in 2017 that Russia was heading in a bad direction overall. And, the very students that I had that had seen the end days of the Soviet Union, they said, maybe we should look and go into a different country. And one of the countries, the one student I had, he's an accountant for a major manufacturer near Moscow. And he was saying, his wife brought up the United States. But his point was, why would I move from a country where I started in a communist country and go to a country that's going into being a communist country?
So you saw the writing on the wall.
Yeah. He said, we're going to have bad times here. They're going to have bad times there. What's the difference?
Hey.
They talked about moving to Sweden, but he didn't want to move somewhere colder. So,
Hey, can we shift gears just slightly?
yeah.
Can you give him a little history about our family and how we're connected to Dalton Township?
Okay, so our family has done some research, genealogical research, and going back, and then I was involved in a project doing a lot of research on Hackley and Hume, William Montague Ferry, General Pritchard and Allegan, connecting the railroads and that. Well, all three of those people I just mentioned started a national bank
Right.
with $50,000 in gold. You
Okay.
could not start a national bank without $50,000 worth of gold sitting in your vault.
Okay.
The one in Allegan actually came back. He was a school teacher when he went to fight for the Union, and he came back and started a national bank with $50,000 in gold. I was a school teacher, and I can just tell you that's not a very
Not very likely.
first time I've heard that. So anyway, there had to have been a story there.
Right.
Anyway, fast forwarding, many countless hours of research later, and the Torrent House and the bowels of the archives here, University of Michigan State. So the Richards family, there's a Richards Park in Muskegon. I always felt like there was some sort of connection, even when I was doing all this research, that our family might have had. Couldn't put my finger on it. And then talking to Al and my uncle Larry, my dad's brothers who are still alive, and looked at some of the genealogical research that our family's done, and come to find out there was a Leander Richards on the board of Hackley National Bank.
Okay.
Well, in order to be on the board, and it might have been a Wright Richards. So in our family, just like a lot of the Knights Templar families going all the way back, Charles Hackley's 11th great grandfather was Sir Roger the Explorer.
Okay.
He knew he was a Knights Templar. His own autobiography says so. And then his 15th grandfather was a mayor of London.
Okay.
And then he traces his genealogy back to the original Knights Templars in 1100s.
Okay.
Okay. So they keep the names going all the way through. I'm studying right now the descendant of William Wallace from Scotland.
Yeah.
So they all keep William Wallace in their name somewhere. So Richards had all these interchangeable names all the way back. Well, we think that Al's grandfather's brother was on the board of Hackley National Bank.
Okay.
That's the connection. And also was the postmaster here in Dalton Township.
Really?
So if you look through the Dalton Township records, you're going to see a postmaster general with the last name of Richards, and that's our relative.
Okay. That's cool.
Yeah.
The genealogy is amazingly interesting. My aunt's been doing it for, I think, 3 decades, maybe more. She has one room in her house.
Okay.
And I hadn't really gotten into it until a few years ago, and now I'm working on expanding it.
Okay.
And luckily, I found one old. That's on my mother's side, which she can take us back to the Mayflower. And then on my father's side, we really didn't have much, but I found this one old yellowed crinkled piece of paper that someone like my great aunt or something had kept, but she's deceased, you know? And I found that, and I was able to get enough information on that to take my father's side back to the Mayflower.
Oh, nice.
And so my mother is descended from Puritans. They were on the Mayflower,
Oh,
but half of them were not Puritans, right? They were strangers, is what the Puritans called them, non-Puritans. My father's side is descended from that side.
From the stranger side.
From the strangers.
One little last connection now too, because, you know, back in Hackley's time, there's more millionaires here per capita than anywhere in the United States. Because they're all lumber barons, they all made it.
not even close. There are 41 millionaires here, which is the equivalent of 100 million now.
There you go. And so, in regards to that, where you have the ARPA type scenario, the money, the grease that greases the wheels, right?
Yeah.
So you had Al Capone was living over here.
Yeah, the Village of Lakewood Club.
Yes.
Connected to Chicago.
Yes, and then my brother Larry that he mentioned was a private contractor, and he was working on a home out in Wolf Lake. And through talking to the present owner of that home, he found out that John Dillinger had lived in that home
Okay.
during the same period of time. Now, tell him about Jesse James. More recently, I found out through Brad about Jesse James.
So I did a first person interview with a 90-plus-year-old lady who my daughter had somehow met through her charitable giving to a Christian organization.
Okay.
And she said, Dad, you're going to want to talk to this lady. So anyway, went and met her and had some tea in her living room. And she said that her grandfather would tell stories of sitting down at Judd Moon's Saloon, which was just up street from the row of prostitute houses here in Muskegon on Ottawa Street.
Okay.
And that when Jesse James came to town, all the locals loved him. He was a strikingly handsome guy that just carried a certain aura about him.
Right. It's personal.
And her grandfather would sit and drink beer with Jesse James. Her grandfather's father would have her grandfather at his knee
Okay.
in Judd Moon Saloon listening to Jesse James talk. And I did go down to the Muskegon County archives. They got to know me there for a while, my wife and I. And a guy that started a national bank in Detroit called James Ducey, a high degree in a certain secretive organization, started a neighborhood here in Muskegon, and there's a James Street, and then there's two more streets next to it with Jesse James's mom and sisters named after him. And then somebody on that block reached out to me and said they were tearing a house apart to redo it, and they found some wanted posters and some other things I won't mention of Jesse James.
Wow.
And so, for whatever reason, Muskegon has been an important part of the North American continent and the way that it was designed to be the new Atlantis over here, to be some sort of special place.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I heard, all I can say when I don't know something is that I have never verified this.
Right.
Like all the other stuff, some of the stuff, brand new stuff. He's talking about the country got purchased as a corporation.
Yes, yes.
I've heard him mention something like that before, but
Yeah, I haven't looked deep.
all I can say is speak for myself. And
Right,
a good
right.
friend of mine told me 2 weeks ago that Zuckerberg came in with Zuckerberg bucks and spent $400,000 just in Muskegon on a van to drive around and pick up ballots and mail in drop boxes. Now, Muskegon, Michigan,
Yeah.
you know, maybe Zuckerberg has so much money that he goes into every city and does this. I don't know. But that seems like an awful lot for a city the size of Muskegon to me.
Right.
And so it kind of makes me wonder if throughout time now, for the last 200 years, is Muskegon kind of a special place in some people's minds?
Sure.
It is, and it will be in the future as well. And then just before I share this, to continue your thoughts. So once he told me this, and you all have a book as well written by a family member, don't you, that talked about Jesse?
A book.
You said you have this book that's worth like $1,000 or something. And
Oh. there's a book that was published
Yeah.
by a man who called himself the grandson of Jesse James.
Yes. Yes.
It's out of print.
Rare edition.
Rare hard copy, yeah.
So as he was sharing some of this information with me, man, it just like came right into my spirit or my thought life, right? The Dalton gang, because I'm focused on Dalton, right?
Right.
So I go do a little quick research on the Dalton gang. Well, I come across this article that talks about Frank Dalton, who said they said he was a centenarian, and then he had a claim that he was Jesse James, right? And so I shoot the question back over to this guy. I say, do you know anything about this? And tell him what your response was.
Well, Frank Dalton most certainly was Jesse James. Jesse James had over 70 aliases. The most famous one being the senator from Montana, William A. Clark, the Copper King.
Okay.
Having said that, Frank Dalton, when he was on his deathbed, 107 years old, had a guy named Trammell there. Trammell was Jesse James' right-hand man, large black guy. It was his best friend. Jesse was really good with the Indians and with the African American, and that was his best friend. And here sat Trammell at 170-year-old Frank Dalton's deathbed. I went to a little pulled-down place in Missouri. They've got original CBS footage of the guy saying, "Are you saying you're Jesse James the Outlaw?" And I mean, it's pretty incredible. But the history books are written by the winners. And deceit runs rampant. You guys have already discussed that in many different details. Deceit runs rampant, and so they're still not going to put that in the history books. But he was not killed shot in the back by Bob Ford in 1882.
All right, so we've established that there's a connection to Dalton County.
I don't know that.
Potential connection.
I don't know that, but yeah,
But
same last name.
But anyways, and Pete Dalton was the guy that kind of started this situation here.
Yeah.
So we had to do a little more research.
Well, it's interesting. I've stopped in Dalton, Georgia before. I took a picture with that sign. We get the zoning administrator, Steve. He gets calls for Dalton, Ohio. We get I've gotten multiple calls for the village of Dalton, Illinois. And I've had to give out that mayor's number a couple of times because they were looking for something. And so there's different places that it could be, but yeah.
The research shows Jesse James was here. The research is clear that Richards, our relative,
Right.
was the postmaster here in Dalton.
Who was a 33-degree Mason?
I couldn't prove that on a document yet.
Okay. That's our suspicion.
I'm
All right.
careful to say if I can't prove it.
Sure, that's right. And I'm going to rewind just real quick. All right, this is a 1927 news article showing America was sold to 5 billionaires: the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, DuPonts, Harrimans, and Warburgs. It says billionaires buy U.S. from billionaires. Future of nation is in yet healthier hands. And there's just a picture of the situation. And now, is that a legitimate article? Is that a legitimate paper? Did somebody just kind of do that? But there's a bunch more evidence that shows us even the name of our country was changed.
I'm very skeptical of media.
Well, of course, especially now. Especially now.
Yeah. And so, I've had the White Beacon has changed a couple of my articles and wouldn't publish my last one called Government Solutions, Government Problems. They would not publish it. So maybe today the new one will come out, which is The Life of Judgment in Politics. We'll see if it's actually out this week.
Do you have a website or
If you go to
page?
JeffThinks.com, it'll come up. It'll redirect you to JeffreyAlexanderMartin.com. But that was so long, people had a hard time remembering.
JeffThinks.com?
JeffThinks.com.
Yeah, I'll put that in.
I have a bunch of stuff.
You've said enough things to make me interested.
But so this is going to be a long wraparound, right? So, but
Yep.
the moral situation to an applied practical situation, right? And I was talking about, so I've been living like I would live in the Soviet Union. And I had a moral obligation to do something when the township was going after the farm. I think they short-circuited due process. So that
What
was,
farm?
Hidden Creek Farm.
Okay.
And it's a farm that I go to that's in a township that I live in, which is the smallest level of government other than villages, right? And so if you don't do something in that situation, when would you do something?
That's right.
Never, right? And I've read a lot of stuff on the Soviets, a lot of stuff on the Nazis, and it's always a good question of when you would do something. One of the best works on it is Carl Jaspers, which invented the idea of the axial age. He invented how they classify mental diseases now. He's a great existential philosopher. He wrote, so he's married to a Jew, right? World War II. He was stopped from teaching at universities and basically put on house arrest for all of World War II. And that was basically it. So after World War II, he goes back. The first series of speech that he gives is on the question of German guilt. Who is guilty of what, right? And obviously, if there's certain people that are more guilty than others, and you're guilty in different ways. How guilty was he for not having actively resisted but just not participating, right? This type of thing.
Yeah, hold the mirror up to yourself.
And it is one of the most revelatory moral books that I've ever come across. So it's an abridged version that they publish as a book. The question of moral guilt is wonderful. And so a bunch of questions like that, right? And so all I did was write an article. Then I wrote a series and I think I did like 21 articles in that series, fighting local government corruption, right?
Yeah.
And I did 2 recalls against the previous supervisor. Filed a police report for an Open Meetings Violation Act and arranged that one meeting where we flooded the township hall and all of that type of stuff. And I tried to recruit someone else for this. I have serious health concerns with spinal deformities and stuff and didn't really want to take this position when I'm doing other stuff in life as well. But I couldn't really get anyone else adequately interested in it, which was interesting because then I was challenged in the primary in a weird way. But anyway, but I end up in the position, right? And so all of that is because of what I consider an acquired moral obligation. So that doesn't stop once you're in the position. So you end up with something like ARPA. And so it's like, all right, this whole bailout culture is going to bankrupt the society. And it has gone bankrupt, right? So in the 70s, right? Nixon took us off the gold standard.
Right.
Yeah, because the United States was bankrupt. So
Right.
we had to inflate our way out of it,
Right.
right? The United States would be bankrupt now, except there's no one to call in the loans. Right? Like, who can call it in?
Well, the Fed will eventually, and that'll crash everything.
Right, but it crashes the whole world. They most likely lose out of that situation too.
But who is the Fed?
Bunch of major private investors, other countries,
Names are in there.
right, billionaires,
Warburg,
bunch of big finance stuff. BlackRock is like $1 trillion company now.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Huge.
Or $1
Huge.
trillion under management, something like that.
Well, tell you what happened with this hidden farms story.
Well, but as that keeps growing, and then we switched out 6 of 7 positions on the board because it was a vote against, right? So people were voting for a change in some way because they figured stuff was wrong. And so, but you end up in the situation for like ARPA. And so you have, it's not good, all of that financial structure that the United States has. But I'm also not in charge of all that. If I was in charge of all of it, I don't know if I could fix it, right? And so, but I have this little piece that I can influence. Not fully in charge anyways. I'm 1 of 7 votes, right? Yeah. And so I have a moral obligation to the people in the township. Now I can reject that money, right? I could say we don't want this money.
Right.
Under the auspices of
But you would
it's
have
a
to-
bad system.
What would your reasoning be?
For rejecting the money
Yes.
would be that it's immoral to tax a bunch of people and then redistribute it in this way because you're going to bankrupt the country, result in a collapse, which is probably going to end up with a ton of death and destruction.
So you know the truth.
Right?
The truth will set you free, brother.
So
Right, but then the question which he's getting at, and I see exactly, you're brilliant. I appreciate it.
I told you he's a good thinker. Yeah.
I know, I've got to leave a little bit. I'm disappointed. Maybe we'll get together again.
yeah, for sure.
So,
For something like this, or just talk.
since we can all three acknowledge that Jeff cannot do one diddly do about the macroeconomic destruction that our representatives in DC are doing, should he therefore cut off his nose, Dalton, to spite his face, because doing that will hurt the residents of Dalton in a way that could have helped them. Is that what did I summarize that?
Correct,
That's
because
what he's
I
thinking.
think you're in the same moral position with, so 53% of our budget comes through state revenue sharing. Our normal budget comes through state revenue sharing. I significantly disagree with the state on several things, and I disagree that 53% of our budget comes through state revenue sharing.
Yeah.
I disagree with almost the entire tax system. I disagree with a lot of the people inside of the township in their morals in various ways. And so do I reject 53%, reject $846,000 from the Fed, reject 53% of our budget from the state, and then reject taxes from all the criminals in the township?
I would say
These
this.
are a similar moral issue.
I would say this to that. is that you as a moral agent, as a representative of the community, knowing the truth and understanding the true nature of things, yes, you need to take that stand. If you don't take that stand, you're just joining the group and becoming complicit.
The oil industry is highly corrupt. Do I not put oil in my car?
If he takes that stand, I'm gonna disagree.
All right.
If he takes that stand, it goes right back to the same people who initially offered it, and they just give other people more.
Well,
That's 100% correct.
That's their prerogative to do evil.
All I do,
That's their prerogative to do evil.
all I do is I guarantee we fail.
Well,
That's all it would do.
not fail. Why?
For sure fail.
Well, yeah, I don't know all the ins and outs of your financial statement, but the thing is, whenever you do what's righteous, God honors it. And believe it or not, He will reward it. And He will bless you. And I've told you guys that from the stand
But
here.
determining the correct moral obligations to fulfill, I don't think is simple. That's why I think it's this case, right? So I have this whole system. I have this whole system that's broken.
You just explained the correct moral stance to us.
Well, he was saying it was
Correct.
broken, not immoral.
That's all
Well,
broken,
But
right?
He knew the problem with it. He knew what was wrong with it.
It's the same thing
If
as
there's either right or wrong. There's no. You know,
I think
flat room.
I think it's incorrect to simplify it that way.
Well,
It's the same thing with, do you think the oil and gas industry is not corrupt?
of course it is.
Do you use gas? Yeah, because you have to.
We're going to travel, but I'm not in a situation like you
You
are
could become Amish.
in government. Well, and I could, and quite frankly, my wife and I, we stay home most of the time.
Right.
But that's because of our situation, and I'm no longer in the
But
workforce.
how do I make things better? How do I make so
By doing what's right.
in the specific ARPA case, right? So I have to determine, do I want to damage the people of Dalton Township,
How would you be damaging them?
not taking this money?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You realize we had a $2 million gap when I came in that we couldn't pay on the sewer debt,
I didn't know that.
right? And so I sold off a bunch of land to generate an extra $500,000 in revenue.
Okay.
And then raised the rates, negotiated a couple of contracts with the county and stuff. So working on all that type of stuff. But if you collapse just the economics of just Dalton, you make a type of statement. But you probably if we get bad enough, the state will just appoint a financial manager to oversee everything. They'll accept the money. It doesn't, how do you actually make a positive difference? And so my case is, yes, there's a complex situation. You take the money because you're participating in a broken system that you 100% already have to participate in, and you don't damage these people disproportionately.
See, my thought is on that is that we're living in a broken world. Everything in this world is broken until the return. And so,
How do you operate in that system?
how do you operate in that system? You render under Caesar what is Caesar. Well, Caesar in this case is doing things that I think any Dave Ramsey financial advisor would say, this is foolish. You're going to destroy your currency and everything else. But when you get down to this microeconomic level, is that really a moral right or a wrong issue when you're living in a broken?
So if I was on,
I don't think it is.
If I was in-
you're living in the government that you're living under.
if I was in federal Congress, I would have voted against ARPA.
Right.
Simple, obvious, right?
But would you have wanted every district let's say you voted against it, but it still passed?
Right.
Should everyone in your district then not take any of that money when all you're doing is then sending it back to other districts that are just going to get all the money?
Well, you can at least do that. He, like Jess explained earlier, you're on a council here. You are not the end all vote. You are not the last say. You are one of 7.
Correct.
But yet you have the opportunity to tell them the truth.
I have the opportunity to make the case.
Make the
And-
case.
and
And,
I've talked-
then
I've talked about-
when the vote comes to vote,
Correct.
you say, no, I do not want to take this money. I will not go along. I will not play the game.
You're disproportionately damaging the people of Dalton Township to make that statement.
You're damaging by taking the money, because when you take corrupt money, you're corrupting what you take the money to use it for. And if you take corrupt money, you're going to corrupt this whole district.
Should
And you don't understand that, and I know you don't understand that, and that's fine.
no,
But that's
I agree with
that's the law of God.
But you're living in the Soviet Union. We call it
Yeah.
the United States.
Every dollar
Right?
in your wallet right now is corrupt.
Right.
Look at the
Do
pictures.
you not use cash? Do you not? I'm saying you're in it, so you have to make the moral decision.
Have I done something wrong in regards to having worked my entire life and contributed to society, and then got to retirement age, and now retired, and we have 2 pensions coming into my home, and taking Social Security.
Well, if you follow your logic rationally, yes, you are.
But if you follow
Because-
mine, you're not.
You're not, because what you did was you worked for an illegal corporation, your words, paid into that, and then now they're paying you back money
Through
in a
ignorance.
corrupt.
Through ignorance.
Okay, but I'm just saying,
Now willfully,
this, you know what this discussion reminds me of?
huh,
I was the president of the teachers union at the local shop that I worked for.
yeah, right. Right.
One of the school board members said, we're going to show the state of Michigan wastes so much money on teachers and their compensation. We're going to show the rest of the state how to do it. So we're going to offer the teachers $20,000 less, and we're going to cut their exorbitant benefits. You know, they got this ridiculous health insurance package and this retirement system. We're going to show the rest of the state. I said, well, you know what we're going to start with too? Your turkey farm. Because no, you're not going to make an example of Dalton Township or Ravenna Public Schools
Yeah.
and hurt those people because you think the state of Michigan is being foolhardy and stupid with their money,
Which they are.
which they are. Okay, which we all agree on. Do I think that it's evil to support organizations that might be doing things that are immoral and illegal according to my belief of what is right and wrong? I do, but our state does it and our federal government does it.
And I think once we come to that place where we truly understand what's going on, we need to resist that. All right? We need to take some form of stand for righteousness.
Yeah, but on what and where, right? So
That's important.
yeah,
Well, I think-
it's very. It's the whole thing.
Yes.
That's the whole question.
Yes. Where is God directing you to take a stand?
Right.
He has you in that chair. He has me over there. You know?
And that's why
He has you wherever you are.
the nail to hit on the head is food sovereignty. That is the nail to.
Let's
hit
talk
on the
about
head.
that for a minute.
It's important, right?
Great segue for me to.
Yeah. You got to take off. I know you did.
Really appreciate you guys and
Yeah, definitely.
love to do this again.
It was great meeting you.
Nice to meet you
I
too.
appreciate you coming out.
Ellen and I talk all the time.
I'll tell you what, let's call the video at this point.
We can do that.
And then you and I have a quick discussion because I want to talk to you a little bit about it anyways.
Do you
And
want
then-
to talk about food sovereignty on the video?
Some other time.
Okay. Yeah.
And
let's-
once we come down with something specific and solid that we're gonna fully follow through with,
Mhm.
yeah, I'd love to talk about that.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you both so much.
Yeah. Really appreciate
Hey,
it.
thank you for the video. Thanks for coming, buddy.
I always learn something.
Well, me too, man. Yeah. Yeah, and you got so much